My name is Alex Rodriguez, and I work for Secure Ideas, or our open source name is Professionally Evil. And I'm going to be doing a presentation on how to use Vagrant for pentesters. So really quick before we get started, the links on the slide currently are for the live version of the presentation. If you want to go to the normal link for the presentation, you can either go to the same links, just drop off the -LV for the first one, or the /live for the second one. And the first one is just a short URL for the second URL. So let's get started. Alright, so we're going to have an overview really quick before we start diving in. So I really like all these things. The first thing is Kali. I use Kali a lot for pen testing, and then I love to automate all the things. So bringing both of those together is Vagrant, which is made by Hashicorp. Hashicorp is a DevOps company, and they create tools for DevOps environments, but we can benefit from those tools because they're supporting them, so they'll be around, and we can use them to automate our workflows. So we're going to go over the basic functionality, what Vagrant is, what we can use it for, why it's important, minimum viable working state, some advantages you get, and then after that we're going to go into essentially step 2, or some more advanced usages, how I utilize it through some bash aliases and my workflow, and then kind of a subsection of that is the plugin ecosystem, how to install them, different ones that you can use, some more popular ones, and then a possible issue you might have that my coworker and I, Bill, ran into, setting up a host-only adapter for him. And then this is not going to involve a Q&A section because we're recording it, but feel free to drop your comments below and we will answer them as soon as possible. So I want to go ahead and start out and apologize for this joke because it's kind of punny, and I was doing a lot of Python programming at the time, so I thought that it would be funny to declare a function for the basic functionality section of this presentation. So to start out with, what Vagrant is, we're not going to go over the installation just because that's going to take up more time that isn't necessary for this presentation. So I will either leave a link in the description of the YouTube video, or there will be a link in the slide notes that you'll be able to access how to install Vagrant. It's going to be a link to the Samurai WTF repo, which is a project that we own and run for web testing framework that includes a YouTube video link as to how you can install Vagrant. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over the installation step, and we're going to dive right into actual key concepts for how Vagrant interacts, how you use it, essentially a high-level overview of what Vagrant is. So you start out with a Vagrant file, indicated up here, this number 1 section, and that Vagrant file is a DSL, or domain-specific language, that's essentially a mix of human-readable code with Ruby programming around it. So you can mix some Ruby programming in to take advantage of the more programmatic features of being able to use a programming language with the human-readable code. So to just let you know, we're not going to look at a Vagrant file just yet. We're just going to go over the high-level overview, and then we're going to go ahead and show you an example of a Vagrant file and how to use all of this later on. So this file consists of a format of interpreted, essentially, keys for Vagrant to understand how to interact with the file and your system, which Vagrant is a CLI program. So we're going to display what Vagrant looks like in a little while. So you essentially declare what will be run inside of this file, and then how you want it to be configured on your machine. So part of that declaration is the hypervisor. In this instance, for the picture, VirtualBox is being used, but you can actually use a whole host of different other hypervisors. Some examples are VMware, QEMU, which is a Linux-specific one, Hyper-V, which is Windows-specific. All these different hypervisors work and interact with Vagrant. So some examples of Vagrant interacting with those hypervisors is once you get the imported virtual machine or VM image into your machine's hypervisor, you can then start configuring that machine settings. And this is all declared inside the Vagrant files. How much memory or how many CPU cores or threads get allocated to your actual machine. You can define that inside the Vagrant file, and it's pretty much limitless what you can define, because there's actual direct calls that you can declare to your hypervisor inside the Vagrant file. So an example of that is right here. We're actually accessing directly into VirtualBox's CLI flags, and we're modifying the VM and telling it to enable bidirectional clipboard mode for the current VM that's getting configured by Vagrant. So that's a quick example of how you can pretty much modify the virtual machine to any type of degree within inside your hypervisor, because you can access direct flags. So next step is the provisioning area. So we've already imported the virtual machine image, which is step number 3, and then we get to step number 4, which is the provisioner step. So inside the provisioner step, what you can do is you can specify what you want your machine or your golden image or virtual machine in general to look like. So you can further customize it, make sure certain services are running, and the provisioners can be as simple as just Bash or PowerShell to all the way as complex as different IAC or infrastructure as code tools such as Ansible, Salt, Chef. So pretty much there's a lot of configuration options. So if you're already using IAC tools, then you can just essentially reuse those different configurations you already have set up. And afterwards, the provisioners interact with that virtual machine that you imported before. So that's step number 5. And then once you get done with that, you can then connect to that machine over SSH or WinRM. And so as I mentioned before, Vagrant works with Hyper-V. So it's works with Windows at a hypervisor level, but it also works with Windows at a VM level as well. So you can remotely connect to that machine from the CLI of Vagrant as well. So then to continue on, what can we use it for and why is it important? Those can kind of be combined. So for example, we can automate the setup of the configuration for the configuration of our pentesting machine from both a hypervisor level, which I mentioned before, CPU cores, memory, networking interfaces, and also at a VM state level. So like I mentioned before, the different provisioners. We can make sure that the Metasploit database is initialized. We can make sure that we have all of our Nmap NSC scripts updated. Pretty much anything that you can think of that needs to happen every single time before you access your machine, you can configure and keep track of what needs to happen inside of that Vagrant file. So we can keep our Kali up to date by making sure that we update all of our, we run apt-get update upgrade whenever we start to spin up the machine. We can also make sure that we have a peace of mind whenever it comes to wiping out client data, because the only client data that we want to hold on to we can store it in a single location on our machine, and then whenever we do a destroy of that virtual machine image, we can make sure that all the extra application data that might get cached normally in between different client tests gets wiped out every single time. Another way that you can do this is by snapshotting your VM beforehand and then running the exact tools that you need to, and then once you get done with running everything for your current test, you can just revert to that snapshot. This is a little bit cleaner because you actually can make sure that you're completely destroying the VM, there's no residual information, and there's no wonkiness from the actual machine image staying in an older state that you'd have to make sure that you update that base image or that base snapshot every single time. So that way you don't have to wait forever for all of your updates to apply. Some other advantages that you would get is that with the Vagrant file declaration format, it's a repeatable environment across all different types of OSs. So like I had mentioned, it works on Windows machines, it works on Linux, it works on OS X. So all of these different OSs, you can make sure that you have a consistently declared VM state, essentially, by making sure that it's regularly updated, and that's actually kind of the first part here, talking about the building, making sure that it's regularly updated. But whenever you get down to the actual pulling the machine image down, you can make sure that it's updated once you start up the VM as well by using the provisioners. Two, you can have a simple scripting interface for either, like I had said, Bash or IAC tools. So that way you can not have to worry about configuring that every time you want to run those types of tools against your machine. Vagrant handles a lot of that interfacing for you, and all you have to do is point it to which scripts or which provisioning tool you want to use. You can also get automated snapshots through the CLI, so this is kind of a more advanced topic that we're going to get to in a little bit, but it's a repeatable interface through the CLI that makes it extremely easy to do snapshotting. And then also, like I had mentioned before, the easy cleanup method to ensure that everything that might be client data or important is removed from your machine, and the only thing that's left behind is the actual information that you save to a encrypted hard drive. So everything gets destroyed whenever you do a Vagrant destroy. If we all use the same image, then we can easily share our personal customizations with either bash scripts or Vagrant files. So initially I gave this presentation to my internal team here at Secure Ideas, but it also applies to anyone else that would reuse the image that we use. So like I said, the example of being able to add your own personal customizations, I have a personalized bash prompt that I use, and I share that with my other coworkers, and you can use it as well. I'll show you how you can access that. If there's a set of tools that you want to use or your team wants in every image, you can build that into the image, which I had mentioned before is more of a Packer job, but you can also include it at runtime as well. So once you do that Vagrant up to do the provisioning step, you can make sure that it pulls down extra tools that might not be included in Kali. So an example of that would be GitRob if you wanted to include a OSINT tool for reconning against Git repos. And you can include automation around them, so that way that whenever you pull down that tool, it also gets configured properly, and you only have to do that once, and then you can share that between anyone else on the internet or inside your internal team. So you can do continued updates to the virtual machine by doing that building step that I mentioned before, which, like I said, is more of a Packer job, and that could be a whole talk in and of itself, is Packer. But you can make sure that whenever you run your pen testing virtual machine, that updates are happening in the background, and then whenever you're ready to update, you'll get a little notification that the box has been updated and that you can pull it down at your earliest convenience. So being able to not have to update immediately is nice whenever you have to make sure that you're actually getting a pen test done for the rest of the week or something, and then you can update next week whenever you're on a different pen test. So here's an example of that little informational box below at the bottom. It says successfully added the box LRA 741 Kali Linux AMD 64, and so that's saying that it's updated to the most recent image, and that shows the exact amount of time. And you can do all of this in the background as well. So I've actually got a cron job set up to where it'll pull down my updated image on Sunday night, so that way on Monday, whenever I get to my machine, I can have the most up-to-date image of Kali. And this can even actually go farther than just pen testing. There's a whole essentially marketplace for Vagrant images called Vagrant Cloud, and that's how you get that informational message of whenever something is updated. Is whenever you start up the Vagrant machine, it goes out to Vagrant Cloud, or Hashicorp's essentially aggregation of Vagrant boxes, which are essentially virtual machine images which with a little bit of extra metadata information included. So it reaches up to Vagrant Cloud and checks to see, alright, is this the most up-to-date version? And see, this is a way that you can specify version formatting, and if someone is on this image, then whenever this image gets released and they go to start up their Vagrant machine, they'll get notified that there's a new release and that they can update whenever they want to. And we're going to show that in a little bit as well. But I just wanted to give you a essentially example and show you where it goes to actually check for those updates. So next we're going to go over a quick demo. And let me get that pulled up real quick. So this is my terminal, and I'm going to be accessing my pen testing area. So I've got an alias to automatically CD into my pen testing directory, and I'm going to attach to my Vagrant demo window, and we're going to just start out with doing a Vagrant help because Vagrant has very robust help and informational documentation. So just to here, make this a little bit easier to read, type it into less. So as you can see, these are all the different essential subcommands that you've got. You've got box and some other subcommands that that you can go through and use the tech help or tech H option to further investigate. The main ones that you're going to use from here are Vagrant up, Vagrant SSH, Vagrant status to see if you've already created the box. Those are a few of the ones that we're going to essentially use throughout this demo. And to show you an example of being able to do subcommands and finding the help for subcommands, we're going to just do Vagrant up tech help, and that's going to show you all the different options that you can do for that subcommand. So we're currently in the demo directory, and if we do an ls here, we're not going to have any files yet. So I've already typed in this command before, and we're going to do a Vagrant init, and Vagrant init is going to initialize a Vagrant file for us. For this specific command, I'm telling it a older box version format, so that way I can show you how a informational message will get popped up. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And I've actually got a alias for pulling out all of my Vagrant aliases as well from my .zsh file, or in lots of instances .bashrc for a lot of other people. So this is my alias to pull out aliases. And as you can see, there are a few things that I try to automate around my automation. Since I said, like I said, automate all the things. One of the things is the vconfig command, which is right here. And that essentially just greps out all the necessary or relevant information from a Vagrant file that's in the current working directory. So let me make that a little bit cleaner by doing this. Alright, so as you can see, the only things in this file that are applicable for being able to interpret from Vagrant's perspective are these two lines. We're actually going to edit that line real quick. We're going to edit that Vagrant file, and I use vedit because I actually have some automation around my way that I connect into the Vagrant boxes that will create a SHA-1 so that way I can make sure that my Vagrant file isn't augmented at all from whenever I've connected to the machine to whenever I disconnect to it. So we're going to add in an extra configuration option that is going to tell one of my Vagrant plugins to not try and interact with this VM. And the only reason why we're doing this is because sometimes whenever it interacts with this, whenever it interacts with these boxes, is that it'll actually fail, and it will take up a lot more time to actually start the machine. So I save the file as root, so that way I can make sure it doesn't. I should save the SHA-sum as root, so that way I can make sure it doesn't get tampered with. So the next command we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and output the config file again, and now you'll be able to see that line is uncommented, so it's getting interpreted by Vagrant. And now we're going to connect. Well, helps if I spell it right. This is why I like tab completion. So while that's starting up, I'm going to go ahead and hop over to my personal configuration that I use. So I'm going to go ahead and just I'm going to kick off this command really quick, and this is going to go ahead and automatically pull down the next box that's already updated. So the current box that I have is actually, I believe it's 2 versions behind. This command checks to see if the current box that I have is outdated. It's only 1 version behind. So the current running box that I have is 0.0.90. And this is a little different format than what you saw before. That's just because this is how I prefer it. And the latest version is 0.0.91. So we're going to run this Vagrant box update command, and we're going to let that run in the background while we continue to interact with my currently configured machine that I have for whenever I do normal pen tests. So I specify the box that I want to use, which is this line right here. And then after that, I configure a, even though this says private network, this is actually a host-only adapter. And that way I can interact with the machine, the virtual machine, without having to go over the normal network or without having to NAT multiple ports to be open. I can just directly access that machine at this IP address. And then I also configure a public network which is essentially a bridged interface. As you can see right here, I specify the interface that I want to bridge. And then I add what's called a synced folder, or a folder that gets added into the virtual machine. And its path is this on my host file system, so /media/varcrypt. And the folder that it gets mounted to inside of the virtual machine is at /client data. And this is where I save all of my, as you can tell, client data, so that way I can make sure that anything that I want to save goes directly into that folder, and there's no possible way for the information to get left on my machine after I destroy that VM. So then I specify some provider or virtual machine hypervisor specific arguments. I give this virtual machine 2 CPUs, 4096 of memory, and then I add the clipboard bidirectional modification. I also configure SSH agent to be true and forward x11 to be true. And the reason why I do that specifically on my Linux machine is because I can actually launch different GUI applications through my terminal through the Vagrant SSH connection if I have these enabled. So I can launch my Firefox browser from inside of my VM through SSH's X11, and that way I don't ever have to actually open up the VirtualBox GUI to access inside the GUI of the actual machine. So I can just have everything that I do be interacted through the terminal, and it'll launch all the GUI applications on my desktop. Then you saw this line earlier for the auto update equals false. Again, sometimes it just takes longer and I don't feel like waiting for it to fail or not fail and just add extra time. And after that, I configure Ansible to run through a few different playbooks that I've configured, and this is actually in a GitHub repo that I'll point you to later. So those are the specific configurations that I do for my pen testing machine. And this is, I swapped back to the original, just bare minimum viable setup. And as you can see, I've got I'm inside the Vagrant machine, and I can do ls/vagrant, and those are the files that I had. And you can see that by me just catting it out real quick. And then scrolling back up so you can see the configuration options that I added. And this is also why I configured the SHA-SUM to get created as well, because as you saw, I was able to interact directly with the /vagrant file, which defined this VM. So one of the things that I definitely caution you about is making sure whatever image you pull down, you know exactly either one, who configured it, or two, how they configured it. And so that way they can't modify this Vagrant file and possibly augment how your machine and your virtual machine interacts with your actual bare metal machine. So now that we've shown you how to interact with a VM, this is not right. Now we're going to just destroy the VM. And now, once this VM gets destroyed, it will no longer exist. And as you can see, default, not created. So let's hop back over here really quick. And you see it says it's going to be about 20 minutes to download. And this is why I suggested setting up a cron job or something, so that way whenever you configure your Vagrant file to exist for your pen testing machine, it can just essentially auto update in the background. If you set up a cron job to run every so often to make sure that it pulls down the updated image. Alright, so we're going to hop back over to the presentation. So that's the demo that I was talking about. Now we're going to get into some more advanced usage. Like I had mentioned before in the demo, the public network or bridged adapter is going to allow you to interact directly with a client's network. So instead of you pulling an internal IP address from your machine, you're going to pull a DHCP address from a client's network, so that way you can interact with it directly. Say you have something like Nessus or some other application that needs direct access. Wireshark would be another good example. You would want to go ahead and configure a bridged adapter so that way you can use those applications directly on the client's network. So another configuration, or another more advanced option that you can use is snapshotting. And one of the things that I do is, once my virtual machine is completely imported and provisioned however I want it to, I take a snapshot, so that way it's very easy for me to restore from that snapshot. And it's a known good state from before the pen test started. So I'm going to show you the video in a second on that's in the presentation right there. But that's going to essentially show you my workflow. And then another way that you can have more advanced usage is mounting those particular file systems inside of your VM for the client-specific data or possible like tool directory, something like that. And that's just being able to mount those shared folders is a more advanced usage, instead of just directly interacting with that /vagrant or the current working directory for the Vagrant file. Alright, so I talked a little bit about how I utilize Vagrant and automating my automation with my bash aliases, and you can actually access all the different bash aliases that I use by going to this URL, and these are all the different ones that I've got, and I'll give you a link to this at the either, like I said, in the bottom of the video notes or inside the presentation notes, so don't worry about trying to write down the URL or anything. Alright, and so now we're going to not zoom in, we're going to click on that and go through the recording that I have. And this is a bash alias that I have to essentially destroy the current image and then bring that image back up, so that way it fully instantiates itself and provisions itself. So I'm going to go ahead and skip the importing step. I'll wait until it gets to 10%, so that way you know that it's starting to import. So you see progress 10%, and now it's at 90%. So I've got this video timestamped down here at the bottom, and all you have to do is click on the actual hyperlink for that time, and it'll bring you to that specific timestamp inside the video. So we already reached the prompt for choosing external interfaces. Now we're going to go ahead and skip to the machine booted successfully and starts to run the VirtualBox Guest Editions ISO installation, and that's that extra plugin that I had, and I didn't disable it for this recording, but it tries to go ahead and update the VirtualBox Guest Editions for the VM. So we're going to go ahead and skip forward, and this is it. It's finished, and now it's going ahead and starting to bring the machine back up, and it's going to start running the Ansible local provisioner. And the reason why I chose to do an Ansible local provisioner is because on Windows it's actually quite difficult to install Ansible. So I tried to make this configuration for the Vagrant file as portable as possible. So Ansible local provisioner will take the playbook that's located currently on your machine and essentially transport it or SCP it up to that machine, and then execute Ansible inside of that machine. So that way everything is self-contained inside the VM and not having to depend on Ansible being installed locally on your machine. So let's go ahead and think this one. Let's see. Alright, there it goes, and it's starting to run the Ansible provisioner, and we're going to skip through, and as you can see, there's the recap, so that means that it finished. I also have configured another plugin called Reload, and that will reboot the machine, so that way if there's any changes that need a virtual machine or your machine to restart, it'll go ahead and restart it. And for this recording, I accidentally stepped away for a cup of coffee and didn't realize to interact with that prompt, so we're going to go ahead and skip ahead to whenever I actually answer that prompt. So now it is doing that connection, and it's waiting for the machine to boot up. And for some reason during this recording it actually took a little while to get to that next step. So it skipped over the VB guest plugin and is now continuing to run the second playbook that I listed, which is after that reload plugin, which reboots the machine. So now we're going to skip ahead to once the virtual machine has been completely provisioned. There are no more provisioner steps. I then have in the alias for the machine to be halted, so that way it stops, and then it does a Vagrant snapshot push, and it takes a snapshot really quick. And as you can see, it says up there, Vagrant snapshot restore can restore that image. And so it then in the bash alias continues to start the machine back up, so that way it can continue along the process. So let's see. Snapshot of the VM. Certain VM. Okay. And now that it's started up the VM, we're just going to go ahead and skip to the end once it's already provisioned everything and everything's connected. We go ahead and the next step after Vagrant up is actually the Vagrant SSH. And so as you can see here, that's that custom prompt I was talking about, and I've successfully SSH'd into the Kali virtual machine image, and then I log out of the image and stop the recording. So that's the quick recording that I've done to go ahead and show you what my workflow looks like. Feel free to augment it however you want to. But like I said, I've got all those bash aliases to kind of get you started into making an efficient workflow from things that I've learned from. Next, let's go ahead and talk about plugins. I already talked about a few of them. Vagrant VB Guest, which tries to automatically update your VirtualBox guest editions. The Vagrant Reload, which reboots your machine in between provisioner steps, so that way you can make sure that if something needs to have an updated kernel before you actually install something else, then it loads in that new kernel once you finish your provisioning. Some other well-known ones are there's a VMware plugin that is actually maintained by Hashicorp, and I'm going to get to this in a little bit. But this is some of the features that they advertise for this VMware plugin for Vagrant. And like I said, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but this is one that you actually have to buy. Normally plugins are free, so don't have to worry about that at all, for the most part. And another example of a plugin is the Vagrant libvirt plugin. And libvirt, or what I was mentioning before, QEMU, is a different type of Linux hypervisor that is really efficient and is very close to bare metal performance. So whenever you're on a Linux machine, I personally like using libvirt QEMU, that stack. And I'm actually working on a personal blog of mine right now to do a Vagrantception or Vagrant and Vagrant machine. So I have a Vagrant machine that is controlled by a Vagrant file that I do a Vagrant up, and then one of those provisioner steps to actually configure that machine that it's bringing up is to install Vagrant and whatever chosen hypervisor I want to inside of that machine. And since I have extended page tables or EPT enabled on my processor, it allows me to run a hypervisor inside of a hypervisor. And the reason why I specifically wanted to come up with this concept was so that way I could have that QEMU libvirt base hypervisor and not have to run other simultaneous hypervisors next to it. Because if I want to try and run VirtualBox and QEMU, it's just not possible. They have some specific, I guess, kernel hooks or something to prevent other hypervisors from interacting with the host whenever one is active compared to another. So that's another plugin that you can install. So up next is the possible issues you might run into. So VMware, like I was mentioning, you have to buy a license for VMware in general. So if you have a VMware license, awesome. But if you go to a new version of VMware, you have to buy another license for, like, say, between 14 and 15. So that can get a little costly. And you only need to buy one instance of that Vagrant VMware plugin from Hashicorp, and it should work for whatever version you have. But it's just extra money. So if you want to, you could use VirtualBox or, like I mentioned, the other built-in hypervisors. And then a VirtualBox specific issue for a host-only adapter was my coworker Bill had run into DNS issues. So there's actually a link that I'm going to provide in the notes for this slideshow to be able to resolve that issue. Lastly was the Q&A section, but like I said, since this is a recording, we're not going to have any. One of the comments that I had actually received during this presentation from my coworkers is that you can actually specify the location of your Vagrant base box image, and you can essentially self-host that wherever you want to. So you could have a S3 bucket that holds all your Vagrant images for you, and then you could have a URL that's pre-signed or allows you to directly access that S3 bucket without having to authenticate, and be able to download that image directly from your infrastructure. Another example would be you could have an internal FTP server running, and you can specify the location for that specific directory inside that Vagrant file, so that way you can pull directly from that machine. And just a little bit of a follow-up for that specific option is that you can also actually host private box images or virtual machine images on Vagrant Cloud as well. So you don't necessarily have to set up your own infrastructure to do it, but there is a caveat there that you do have to pay for those private images. So it's kind of like how GitHub, if you wanted to have, before, if you wanted to have private repos on GitHub, you used to have to pay. It's kind of that same concept. Alright, and that's everything. Like I said, leave any comments below. We'll try and answer them as quickly as possible. And if you go back to the beginning of the slides, you can access the link for the slides by just dropping off that -lv or /live, and feel free. I link directly to the GitHub repo from where I'm doing the presentation of these slides, so that will allow you to directly access the Vagrant file that I had specified earlier. Let's see, GitHub. Here. Yeah. So, I'm gonna have this link in the slides, but you can go to this GitHub repo, clone it, and then if you cd into this directory, this is all my specific VirtualBox customization. So you remember that Vagrant file that I talked about earlier? This is it right here. So I've added all this and made it public on GitHub, so that way you can configure and run it exactly how you want to. But you can use my Vagrant file that I have as a template for if you want to add specific customizations on top of it. And it also has all the different customizations that I was talking about, so the base.yaml, and this just updates Kali and installs snapd, which allows you to install snaps. And then also I start up the Metasploit database right here. I initialize the database, and I also make sure my nmap NSC scripts are updated, and I do a few other configurations. So if they're not to your liking, feel free to augment it however you want to. If you want to submit pull requests, feel free. I might not accept it because it's my configuration, but another one of my coworkers is actually working on submitting a pull request for being able to do, instead of bash aliases, PowerShell aliases, or a function inside of PowerShell to help do the same automations that I do inside of bash aliases for PowerShell. So that's just another example of being able to contribute back and share more of what you think could be added to this GitHub repo. Alright, well, I hope you have a good day. Take care.